Hi, this is William Henderson with some comments before the episode starts. So first, we're going to start dividing episodes up into 2 or 3 episodes. So basically, the first couple episodes we did lasted longer than we expected. They lasted an hour to, an hour 20 minutes, something like that. And we decided it made more sense to cut it down to like 30 minutes to an hour and have it come out every week instead of every other week. And it just kind of makes it easier for us, and I think it just kind of works out better on your end as well. So that's something that we'll be doing. And so this is the first podcast episode we'll be doing that. It'll be probably 3 episodes. Another thing is that the next couple episodes were recorded when I was sick, so if my voice sounds a little different, that's why. So just to kind of keep that in mind. All right, we'll get started. This is William Henderson.
And this is B. McGraw.
And this is the Unjerked podcast. So the Unjerked podcast is the inverse of B. McGraw's website, which is
the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
So instead of making fake academic journal articles, we're basically doing the opposite and finding problems that people talk about a lot online and finding what the actual research says about it. And so this episode, we're going to talk about something fairly controversial and a big topic for everyone, which is housing prices. And more expansively, also, like, what role does zoning play in the housing market? But we're going to first focus on talking about housing. Why is it so expensive? Really kind of dig deep into that. So what are some things that people are saying about housing?
Oh, well, zoning does come in quite a bit, and then there's a lot of angst about investors buying multiple properties just to make money off of short-term or long-term rentals, but mostly the short-term rentals get people most angry, as well as foreign investors and people owning vacation homes that they don't even use. Also, older generations just holding on to property and never selling. Plenty of stuff like that.
So I think all of those things technically do contribute. So they're not false per se, but I think the sort of priority of like which is a larger contributor to the problem, I think that's where a lot of people tend to get it wrong. For example, Airbnbs, we're going to talk about that later. Do they increase rent prices? Seems like they do. But is that the main reason why rent's going up? It seems unlikely. So first, when it comes to the international sort of perspective, it's kind of interesting when you look at, okay, how does U.S. housing look affordability wise compared to other countries? There's mixed information. So I found a think tank called the Urban Reform Institute, and they calculated basically what is the gross income, what is the home price to gross income ratio. So this is not net of taxes, this is gross income, so it's not the perfect comparison. But according to them, U.S. housing is cheaper than Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Ireland, New Zealand, Singapore, and the UK. On the other hand, the OECD, which is a big sort of intergovernmental organization, on their data, they show the U.S. being a little on the higher side when it comes to price to income ratio. So if you look at the OECD, the U.S. is number 3 out of however many, 20 something, I don't know what the number is, but however many countries are in the OECD. The OECD is mostly developed countries. It's mostly wealthier countries, but it also includes Colombia, Chile, and a bunch of Eastern European countries, which are less wealthy. So it's a rough proxy for basically like developed world. And then when you look at the price to rent ratio, so there's no, I couldn't find data on like income to rent ratio. So you kind of have to look at it, you have to kind of induce it from price to income plus price to rent. But when you look at price to income or price to rent, which is a proxy for like who is getting basically like owner versus renter, who gets the surplus is kind of what it's a proxy for.
What do you think is the discrepancy between these two stats? So it's the OECD and what else?
The other one is a think tank. It's the Urban Reform Institute. So
Okay.
I don't know what the answer is, and I think the data I've looked, because there's some websites I wanted to use, but they didn't really source their data, so I couldn't use it. The trend I see for the most part seems to be that the US is kind of in the middle of the pack. I don't know why there's that discrepancy, but the trend I see is that they're kind of in the middle when it comes to housing affordability. When it comes to, and that's median incomes, I couldn't find like what about bottom quartile. I just couldn't find that info.
Yeah. We in our Google Docs where we're discussing what to talk about. I think a lot of it would be worthwhile to look at bottom quartiles incomes to low income housing, just since that's where a lot of the aches and pains are and controversies.
When it comes to home ownership rates, the reality is essentially, the only place that collects all the data is there's a Wikipedia page, so it does cite reputable sources. So we'll put those on the show notes. But basically, when you look at homeownership rates, the one trend you see is that a lot of the places with relatively high homeownership rates are actually very poor countries. Yeah, so that's an interesting trend that's a little counterintuitive, where like the poorest countries, like many of these data sets, most of Africa is not included. It's just what you tend to see is a lot of, but when you look at, most of Asia, the few Latin American countries that are included, there's actually a relatively high rate of home ownership in less wealthy countries. And I don't know why this is. I have a few theories. So one theory I think
the one you already put on there is that in lower income countries, there are less places to put your money other than your home.
Yeah, basically. So I know in China, so technically you're not allowed. So technically the government owns all land in China. And they basically do 99-year leases to people, to developers and homeowners. So I might be getting this wrong, but my understanding is that in China, basically the government owns the land, you're leasing it for 99 years at a time, and you own the actual building. I want to add a quick comment in post-production here. So the actual length of these leases is actually up to 70 years, not 99 years. I'm not really sure where I got that 99 figure wrong, but it is in fact 70. And so what you tend to see, so technically, it's government-owned land, but practically speaking, people own property. And in China, people just don't trust the stock market. And that's just kind of it's kind of a thing. It's a cultural issue. There's perhaps some economic reasons behind that. And the stock market is specifically the returns to owners of capital in companies. So the stock market is not like how much money are the workers making. That's an expense for the shareholders. And so the stock market is very specifically about how much do owners of shares make in companies in this country. And the sort of quality of the stock market varies by country to country. Some countries have very small stock markets that are very illiquid. Some countries, most businesses are privately owned and don't trade on a public market. And so those are some confounding issues. I also am not sure about capital control rules. Like in different countries, can people own U.S. stocks? Or are there laws in either the U.S. or in that country that limit the amount of foreign stocks you can own? So there's a lot of extra sort of, extra reasons involved as to why people don't own stocks in certain countries. I think part of it might also be it almost feels not real. Like if you have a number in an account at like Schwab or whatever, you might be like, okay, well, there's a digit in a database. Like, how do I know that won't go away? I think in practice in the US, that's not something most people are worried about. That could be another worry. Whereas if you have a house, it's pretty obvious it's a real thing.
Yeah, that's one thing that we should really count ourselves lucky as having, living in the country that has the global reserve currency, where the number kind of feels more real than somewhere else.
Yeah, and then another theory I have is that building costs are probably just cheaper in many poor countries. And a third reason I think is in many countries culturally, like I believe in China, the sort of price to income ratio is actually very high for real estate. So it actually costs, the houses are actually very expensive relative to income. But I believe culturally what happens is that the whole family pools money together to help make
Oh, so it's
purchases.
a lot more actual single family homes, not just one person wanting a single family home.
Well, a lot of times you have a large extended family living in the home, right?
Yeah.
So
Oh, so even more. Yeah.
yeah, so those are possibly some reasons, but that's kind of an interesting thing that a lot of these um, less wealthy countries often have higher home ownership rates. When it comes to the U.S. specifically, so there's a website I found that kind of really digs into the data around, there's the Case-Shiller index, which basically is kind of the authoritative index that looks at home prices. And basically they adjust it for, what is inflation, and also what is the increase in square footage, because the size of houses has been increasing as well. And so they actually have a chart which, if you adjust for inflation and square footage, home prices have actually been flat for like the past several decades. The data did end at 2020. What I've read is that there actually has been an increase, inflation adjusted per square footage, in the past 3 years. And so that trend is kind of broken a little bit in the past 3 years specifically. But overall, there is a trend where, actually the reason why prices are going up, one is inflation, which happens to everything, but a big reason why is houses are getting bigger. And that's a huge reason why prices are going up. When you look at, okay, like what about compared to wages? Because, inflation might be eating away at that. And when you actually look at household wages adjusted for income, they've been mostly been going up since the 80s. So CPI US adjusted dollars in 1984, it was $56,700. In 2022 is 74.58. And this is after inflation. So that doesn't really explain anything. Interestingly, this also, when you look at inflation adjusted median incomes, they've actually been going down since 2019, which explains a lot of the complaints about the economy right now. People are, because when you look at the numbers, it's like unemployment is extremely low, wages are growing. Like if you look at most of the numbers, the economy is very, very solid right now, but people are very unhappy. The reason is probably when you actually look at inflation adjusted income, it's been going down since 2019.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, it looks like it really shot up after the '08 recovery. So on average, so far, it's
still higher,
maintaining the trend. Yes.
It's still higher than it was in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's just people hate it when there's an upward trend and then it reverses, even for a short time. That pisses people off. That makes people very angry. So,
yep. Well, I think that mostly has to do with inflation more than anything.
Yeah. When you look, and when we talk about household income, people bring up, well, back in the day, only one person worked. Now two people work. That's a fair point. I think one thing I want to add to that is, like, historically, usually everyone worked in a household. Like, even the old people worked until they died. Like, everyone worked on the farm. So, you know, I
Yeah,
think,
it just wasn't something that was trackable by modern economic metrics.
yeah. When it comes to home ownership by generation, so,
This
and
is I always see this plot come up where you see all of this generational wealth being built up by boomers and then Gen Xers and then millennials are way down at the bottom. Oh, I
so
should have saved one.
it's important to adjust for age, because obviously boomers are wealthier than the other generations because there's more of them.
They're older.
They're old.
Yeah.
They're older. So if you adjust for age, so like, okay, let's compare every cohort when they were age 30, for example. Millennials are behind, but not by a ton. So at age 30, the other cohorts basically were about 50% homeowners. Um, for It's hard to read from the graph, but for millennials, it looks like 40 to 45%.
Mm-hmm.
So millennials are behind, but not by a lot. And in fact, I read a news article recently that looked at total savings between generations.
So
Not
that's
just,
with percentage of home ownership.
yeah.
I saw another one that like had it more on like an inflation adjusted dollar amount that just made it look minuscule.
Well, I think home ownership rate is probably the most useful metric when you're talking about like which generations, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the main complaint when you talk about like intergenerational beef related to the housing market. And I read a news article recently that actually looked at total savings between generations. So not just housing, but also retirement accounts and other things like that. And that study showed that millennials actually have more money saved up than boomers did. And
Oh, really?
the reason why is, although they're behind on home ownership, these days there's a lot more retirement plans that are automatic enrollment. So they'll
Oh, true.
automatically put you into a 401k. And so because of that, a lot of millennials compared to boomers at the same age are automatically having their money put into the stock market. So, another interesting trend there. So, yes, so what you see is housing costs more. It is a regional thing, obviously, because you can say, well, on Zillow, when you look at this one house, so it's the same house, it's gone up by price 10% a year for the past 10 years. And what we're looking at here is an overall picture. So when you look at hot markets, it does outpace inflation if you're looking at the West Coast, Northeast, etc. But there's a lot of markets where the opposite is the case. So that's basically the picture of what's going on. And another thing that is important to consider is the nature of neighborhoods. And this is really going to be important later when we talk about the causes of higher prices. So in the old days, as far as city design went, so mixed use multifamily was the norm of how neighborhoods worked. So you had tons of duplexes, triplexes, apartments. You had local stores. And then in the 20th century, that started to change. So essentially, there were legitimate issues in crowded cities. You had unsanitary, neighbors were loud, crowded, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a movement towards regulating that problem away. And so what they ended up doing was creating, and this happened at the local level, but cities implemented pretty strict zoning laws across the country. And that's the main reason US cities are designed the way they are. It's not because of, market forces, it's because that's mandated. So when you look at why are there strip malls that are separated from the neighborhood, that's a legal requirement. Why are houses, so spread out from the city center? That's required. Um, why didn't this happen in Europe? Because same problems happen in Europe when it comes to crowded, unsanitary cities. My guess is there's probably a historical pride in the traditional way these cities were designed. So there's probably resistance to just completely changing.
Yeah, and a lot of their cities already had a lot more infrastructure built up. While I mean, a lot of our cities were built with cars, is what I always hear, and that's why they're all spread out because of cars.
Well, I think cars are a necessary but not sufficient condition. So you can't build extremely spread out cities without cars because, like, you literally can't get from A to B. So you need cars for that development to take place. But having cars itself will not create development like that because in Europe, people have cars in Europe too. But what you don't see, people in the city center might not, but most people, many people still have cars. I think, but you don't see huge spread out cities. So I think that's primarily a zoning led problem, not a car problem. And this isn't a public transportation episode. I think cars are not inherently a bad thing. I think each transportation method has its own benefits and pluses and minuses. But obviously cars, there are issues with cars in certain contexts for sure. So let's go over some causes that are not real causes of this problem. So one is investors buying up all the housing. So yes, there has been an increase in investor ownership. So from 2000 to 2023, investors have gone from 7%, roughly speaking, to about 18% of total market share. So it's been steadily been going.
Yeah, that's kind of significant. Was it increasing before that 2008, or did they cut it off there for a reason?
2000, but yeah, they cut it
2000.
off.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the reason I don't want to call this a primary cause is because there's another cause that causes this. So this is more
the cheap money.
Well, there's two reasons that I think lead to this. So this is more of a secondary cause. If you look at, and a lot of people blame large investment firms, like Blackstone. They'll say BlackRock, but they're talking about Blackstone. When you look at corporate ownership, it's spiked up quite a bit in the past couple years, but it's still only like 1.6 to 2.5, 1.7 to 2.5%, roughly speaking, of the total market. And it used to be even lower than that. It used to be close to zero. So corporate ownership of especially single family houses is very, very low. It's very low. When we're talking about this growth, this growth in investor ownership, this is mostly people who own like 2 to 4 homes. This is not, huge Wall Street firms. That's one thing I keep reading online.
Well, that does come up when I look at the online arguments, is like there are just too many people that are owning 2 to 4 homes that it's going to push out the people that just want one home.
Yeah, I think there's more to say about that we can go into later. I think, again, there's other things that lead to that. So I don't think that's a primary cause. Another thing to look at. Another cause that I hear online is that basically people are just building apartments and just keeping them empty for like money laundering purposes.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it makes no sense because the way so developers, investors, they build a house, they build an apartment. They don't fund that. Typically, they don't fund that with just cash outright. They typically have a mortgage, just like normal people. It's a commercial mortgage instead of a residential, but they borrow that money. So if you say they're building apartments, that they're keeping them empty, what you're saying is they pay all cash, or what you're saying is they build an apartment, they have a mortgage payment, there's no cash inflow, and so they're just like paying all of that out of pocket. So you're saying they raise a ton of money, they put a ton of that money into a house, and they set aside a giant chunk of change just to pay off the mortgage. Insanely capital inefficient, like very, very capital inefficient, because businesses don't want to have their money tied up in non-productive assets. They don't, even productive assets, businesses don't want to have huge piles of inventory. They don't want to have tons of buildings. They typically want to either have their money in cash or in cash flowing assets. So, and the other thing is, like, when you go to apartment buildings downtown, sit there for an hour, you'll see people go inside the building. Like this idea that like all these buildings are empty is like, it's not true, like, at all.
Are you sure they're not government plants or mannequins they rig up to move around and turn the lights on and off?
Home Alone style.
Yeah, Home Alone style, exactly.
Didn't think about that.
Yeah, that's we need to confirm this before we totally discount this theory.
And one thing I won't, like, yes, there's people who own vacation homes, and it's probably empty most of the year. That I couldn't find data on it, but that's definitely a thing. But if you're talking about like large apartment complexes, there's no way that people build apartment complexes and keep them empty. That's just ridiculous. Like, people who think that don't know how businesses work, because like nobody can you can't afford that as a business. You're just bleeding cash month after month, and you have like a giant, and investors are just like giving you like tons of money to just like pay off a mortgage, and there's no money coming in. Like, it makes no sense.
Yeah, and I think most quote unquote vacation houses would be in a location where that is kind of the norm. People have their vacation homes, and there really is an industry there, or at least not that much. So they're not really buying houses from other people who would want to live there. So I don't know.
Yeah. And when you look at rental vacancy rates right now, they are close to historic lows. So they're at 6.4%.
Oh, wow, that is really low.
And for reference, in 2009, they were up at 11%. So the two low periods, one was 1969 to 84, so most of the 70s and early 80s, and then the other period is now.
Well, I mean, that kind of makes sense just generationally, because 69 till probably the 80s probably would have been when the boomers would have just been starting out to live outside of their parents' house but couldn't afford a house. And that's kind of where a bunch of millennials are right now, is they're not living with their parents, but they're not buying a home.
Right. So,
and we are the two big generations.
So vacancies are not high. They're very low. When it comes to, another thing I hear is like, well, whenever developers do build luxury, or whenever developers do build apartments, they only build luxury apartments. And that's a big complaint I hear. First issue I have with that, luxury apartment is a marketing term. So, okay, like, what does it mean? Like, because it has a sign that says luxury apartments, like, that means nothing.
I think it comes with a bath towel or a bathrobe, and it's got the 4 stars, and the lobby has a big Christmas tree around now.
So I think what people usually mean is it usually has a pool on the top floor, and it probably has like granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and there might be a concierge desk at the first floor. Is there anything else I'm missing?
Maybe a gym. I think it's just generally more amenities and nicer appliances.
Yeah. And I think my argument to this is so basically, when it comes to new builds, it's a little different on the secondaries market, but on with new builds, um, the luxury segment is more profitable to developers. So if there's a housing shortage, they're going to focus first on what makes them the most money. So, but I think beyond that, there's a strong argument for allowing this practice because the argument for and against. So the argument for is basically, it's still housing stock. It's, even if it's higher rents, it'll increase overall supply and hence decrease overall prices. The counter argument is like, well, it does increase overall supply, but there's also an induced demand effect. So if you build luxury apartments, more wealthy people want to live in that neighborhood, aka gentrification, and that'll increase demand. And so overall, rents will go up. And there's actually been several studies into this. And the data pretty much says the supply effect predominates. So rents go down overall. So they've looked at, they've looked at essentially like, okay, like what happens to overall rents? And it's pretty clear. So there's this one study, and it says, I provide evidence that for every 10% increase in the housing stock, rents decrease 1% and sales prices decrease within 500 feet. And, it's pretty clear that if you because what happens when you build a luxury apartment is that soaks up demand for that segment of the market. It soaks up the demand for nicer units. And what happens, so let's say, I don't think any cities are doing this, but let's say they banned luxury apartments. What would happen? Well, wealthy people would just buy up existing
real houses. Yeah.
And just do a fix and flip. Or maybe not flip it, but they'll keep it and just, remodel the interior. And that's what happens. So, and there's this news story. You tend to see this sometimes where and this is a weird problem because both sides, there's an argument on both sides for increasing housing supply, but on both sides, you see a lot of resistance to it. And on the sort of left-wing side, there's a huge fear that it'll increase rents. And it doesn't at all. It does the opposite. So there's a filtering effect that goes in both directions in the housing. So housing can be upgraded or it can be downgraded. So the way it upgrades is someone buys it, remodels it. The way it downgrades is basically the rich people move into new apartments. And so the existing apartment is sold to less wealthy people. That's how it downgrades. And so a lot of what are now affordable units used to be new apartments that wealthier people owned. But over time, tastes shift, amenities shift. And so, for example, air conditioning used to be a very niche thing. Now it's, depends on the locale, but in a lot of places, everyone has air conditioning. So that's an example where units that have air conditioning have filtered down. So even affordable housing in certain cities have air conditioning.
Yeah,
So,
I hear that argument all the time. The classic example is, smartphones. I mean, it kind of would have been ridiculous. Oh, why are you making all these super luxurious smartphones when only the top whatever percentage wealthy people can have the BlackBerry to have internet, at their fingertips, when in reality it was like, yes, you do this, and then it just moves the goalpost for wealth, and now almost everyone has a smartphone. Yeah, some people might have the super nice smartphone with a really fancy camera, but yeah, now everyone has internet at their fingertips. So it's just moving the goalposts. It's a societal hedonistic treadmill. Also, to add to the luxury apartment conversation, I have noticed, especially in my neighborhood, that most of the luxury apartments, I think, tend to be more dense, land use wise, just from the nature of now one of the amenities is being in a high rise and having a nice rooftop view or view from your apartment. So then they end up just being more dense housing, which I think is just a better use of land in general.
Yeah, so this is a good segue into the actual causes of what raises or lowers prices, and it's supply and demand. It's as simple as that. You know, market forces are a thing, and it's the same in housing. So my argument is that in current 21st century America, we're mostly dealing with a supply issue. So first is zoning. So when it comes to zoning, there's a nonprofit that I follow called Strong Towns, and a lot of my arguments are kind of the same as their arguments. So before anyone claims plagiarism, that's where I got a lot of my inspiration from. But basically, the argument is there is a massive, massive restriction on the supply of housing and the types of neighborhood arrangements available in this country because of zoning laws. So we'll go into more detail later about specific zoning laws, but basically, there's data that shows, upzoning. So upzoning is when you go from like single family, for example, from single family to multifamily. And, there's this paper from, I think, the Journal of Urban Studies, and it says land use reform and housing costs. Does allowing for increased density lead to greater reform? And it says we find reforms that loosen restrictions are associated with statistically significant 0.8 increase in housing supply within 3 to 9 years of reform passage. So, upzoning does increase housing supply. Another interesting thing, so parking minimums are a huge zoning requirement. And so there's this Victoria Transport Policy Institute, and they look at parking requirement impacts on housing affordability. And they basically say, so currently a lot of jurisdictions are reforming parking policies, reducing the number of required parking lots for a given unit. And it says these reforms can reduce the cost of basic low-priced housing by 10 to 20%. So a lot of, most cities, they'll say, like, depending on whether you're a residential or commercial, property, they'll say, like, for every square foot of property that you have to have X number of parking spots. And it's just a hard, fast rule. Like, oh, your property is this big, you have to have this many parking spots, period. It doesn't matter what you're using it for. What if, like, everyone who went to the thing was, like, from the neighborhood, so, like, they all walk there? It doesn't matter. You still have to have parking. And so that's why when you look at a lot of strip malls, like, more than half of the parking lots or parking spaces are always empty. Like, yeah. I don't know if you've noticed that, but, like,
oh, I have.
Yeah, you'll have these, like, massive Walmart parking lots that are just, like, almost completely empty. And that's because they're required to have these huge parking lots. And if you look at a map of any major American city, whether it's, like, St. Louis or LA or Seattle or whatever, and you look at the core downtown, which should be, and it is, the densest part of the city, still half of the entire surface area is just parking lots and roads. Like, in the most dense part of the city, it's just half pavement. So that's a huge thing. Another thing is lot size minimums. So, I mean, lot size minimums tend to exist almost everywhere. I think the question is, how small are the minimums? And my argument is that current minimums in most U.S. cities are way too big. So, I mean, the only minimum to me that makes sense is, like, okay, you don't want to build a house that's, like, so narrow that, like, it's impossible to escape if there's a fire, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's safety reasons. You don't want a house that's, like, 2 feet wide. That said, like, why do you need whatever the size is? I think they typically tend to be bigger than they need to be. And so this researcher, there's a paper that says the effects of residential zoning in U.S. housing markets. Professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he says that doubling the minimum lot area increases sales prices by 14% and rents by 6% and intensifies residential segregation. So that is another issue. And there's a paper here that says, well, this is from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. So yes, they have an agenda, but they have pretty solid sourcing of their of their data sources. And basically their result shows that 20% of the variation in housing growth is attributable to density regulations. So,
Whoa.
And finally, there's a paper, or there's more info from the Cato Institute, which says that basically each acre of lot minimum size leads to a 50% drop in building permits. So this is like a massive reason why
This sounds like it's undeniable at this point.
And also, like, when you look at, I said before, square foot and inflation adjusted prices have not gone up a ton. That said, square footage has increased considerably. So the actual price of housing has gone up. Reason why is houses are bigger now. And a lot of that is legally mandated. Like, it is illegal to build what used to be normal houses. This is moving on from zoning. So there's an interesting article from Bloomberg that looks into the 30-year mortgage and its effect on the market. So the 30-year mortgage doesn't exist in most countries. In most countries, and it used to be this way in the US as well, you had basically like 5 to 7 year mortgages with a balloon payment at the end. So you paid your mortgage for 5 to 7 years, amortized for a longer period, so you're not paying everything off at once. But at year 7, you have to pay everything off. In practice, you're not going to actually do that. So what happens is people either sell their house or they refinance into a new mortgage. The reason 30-year mortgages exist in the U.S. is because there's government subsidy. Basically, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will essentially take mortgages off the books of mortgage brokers, and basically there's different regulations that essentially lead to a subsidization of the 30-year mortgage. So, and I think there's debates about whether this is a good or bad thing. That said, I do think this mutes the effect. For example, if interest rates rise like they are right now, but that's supposed to lower home prices, and it is a little bit, but I think that effect is muted because you have a lot of people have very low rates locked in for the next 30 years, and they're like, I'm just going to sit on this, I'm not going to sell it, right? And so I think the 30-year mortgage can really kind of counteract any downward pressures on housing prices. So, all right, next week we're going to do part 2 of this episode.
See you then.